Hi, everyone. I am Joel Clarkson. I am thrilled to chat with you today about liturgy and to sort of take what we've been chatting about for the whole day and sort of hone it in. So we've heard a lot about imagination. We've heard a lot about incarnation and sacrament. We've heard a lot about these ways in which we sort of engage with artistry and how we want that to be part of our lives. But then there comes that second part, which is saying this is what is true and beautiful. How do we make it real? As a matter of fact, for those of you who are in Lanier's talk, there was actually that question. She had mentioned the great C.S. Lewis quote, reason is the organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. So we have to get from what we know to actually manifesting it in our lives. And that's what the point of this talk is. It's to sort of put your imagination to work. That's what liturgy does. It puts your imagination to work. So I'm going to start out by sort of introducing myself in a minute, but I want to give you a brief overview so you kind of know what's going to happen. So I'm going to sort of talk at you for 20 minutes. I know you've had some of that today, so I won't do it much more than that. And then we're going to sort of break into small groups, and we're going to do something along the lines of what I'm going to share in the talk, which is observation and response to some artwork. And then finally, we're going to sort of go into a time where you're each going to get to work on a liturgical game plan, or liturgical blueprint, as it were, where we're going to sort of take some of this and put it into action. So with that said, let's get started. So again, my name is Joel Clarkson. By day, I'm a composer and have worked in film, TV, and concert music. And by night, I'm a liturgical crime-fighting warrior who fights to bring good rhythm and ritual back to the sacred spaces of Gotham, especially in choral music, which has been a passion of mine for a long time. I got my professional starts in both of those worlds in Boston, Massachusetts, where I did studies in composition and conducting at Berklee College of Music. And simultaneously, I began what has become an almost decade-long sort of interaction and journey into the riches of Anglican liturgy. That's my tradition, Anglicanism, and what I share with you today will sort of emerge out of what I have learned in that time that I have spent becoming more Anglican and learning more about the church and more about liturgy in that process. Having grown up in a vibrant evangelical non-denominational family, words like liturgy, sacrament, and incarnation were not common, but the experience of them was. I had a lot of rhythms that I and my siblings participated in, including reading a lot of classic literature, engaging with music, engaging with art, having really sort of invigorating Socratic discussion at the dinner table, especially a lot of feasting with a lot of talking, which is great. And then especially an intensive focus on creative writing, a dynamic engagement with the natural world. Wherever we lived, whether it was in a very rural setting or even in an urban setting, my family lived in all those different places. We moved quite a bit. My parents moved to spaces where they felt that we would be able to engage with the world around us. So even we lived in urban Fort Worth at one point in Texas, and I remember that we had just behind our small quarter to half acre yard, paths that connected to a sort of river system in Fort Worth. So we were actually able to sort of have this massive backyard. And then we continued that when we moved here to Colorado for the first time, and I was in high school, just beginning to sort of stare high school in the face. And we moved to a house that backed up to Pike National Forest, and so I had a 200-something thousand acre backyard. It was amazing, you know. And that mediated to me the connection between what I was learning, what I was gaining, and the real world around me. There wasn't this disconnect between these spiritual ideas that my parents wanted me to understand and the world in which I lived. They were connected, they were interconnected. We didn't use words like liturgy, but that's what it was. They were liturgies that shaped me. So that was my background. And when I finally came around to Anglicanism in college, it was like I started to gain the vocabulary for something that I've always known to be true my entire life. I think this is probably something a lot of us have experienced, is knowing something. And Lanier talked about this, sort of not necessarily learning something new, but learning to be able to articulate something that we have always known to be true intrinsically deep inside of us. That's sort of how liturgy assists us. It helps to give us words to use to walk in these paths. My day-to-day work has involved a multitude of creative endeavors, from composing and orchestrating to working in Christian nonfiction as a writer, to narrating audiobooks. But the choral tradition has always been a passion of mine. The music of the church, using our voices not just to speak but to sing, and to use this language which mediates sacrament to us. And so I've I've worked with various choirs along the way, writing music. I've actually sort of what got me very involved with the Ensemble was doing a project called Choral Jam, in which both people who know choral music and people who don't, people who could read music and people who weren't able to, gathered together in a very informal setting to engage in this, to sing and to listen and to just become aware of this tradition, this rich tradition in the church. This is absolutely amazing, and that's part of what brought me here to speak to you today. So, let's get to the main question, because I did tell you that you are a creative type. So how do I know this? Well, let me tell you a story. We've all heard it before. An unlikely boy living in the countryside with his family is found to be the anointed one to save his people and lead them out of the oppression of an evil tyrant. He's called out from his home by a wise, sage man, an old and respected voice, who begins a long and engaged spiritual instruction of the young boy, preparing him for his future role as a leader of his people. Early on in his story, he defeats a seemingly invincible foe, a giant beyond imagining, putting his trust not in weaponry, but rather in the force for good which lives within him and empowers him to defeat the Goliath which threatens the very existence of his people. He is destined to ascend to the place of his predecessor, who, while still ruling on the throne, has lost the blessing of the life of the Spirit within him, having refused to be shaped by the old ways which would have formed him into a righteous ruler, and whose days are now numbered. And yet, for reasons not immediately clear at first, our hero is not yet able to step into leadership. Instead, he walks into exile. And it is there where he learns to practice the ways of wisdom, disciplining himself as he prepares to re-enter the world in triumph. In time, when the chosen one decides to walk in those old ways and not seek his own power, he is allowed to ascend to leadership and his predecessor is defeated. Of course, you know of whom I'm speaking. Luke Skywalker is our protagonist. Obi-Wan, his wise sage. Luke's early defeat of the Death Star, his giant in the land, sets him on a course for victory. But before he can step into the role of Jedi, he must wait, learning the steps of the ancient paths. He finds himself hiding in the Dagobah system, where Yoda teaches him those liturgies, patiently training him in the ways of the Force. Only when he has rejected selfishness and learned to dance to the rhythm of the shaping power of the Force can he rise up and become a righteous leader. This is a common story, being shaped by rituals which bring mastery over the self and lead to freedom and happiness. Mr. Miyagi takes Daniel under his wing, who learns to control his actions and is transformed from a rash teen into the Karate Kid. Eustace must let go of his insufferable self-importance, allowing Aslan to remove the scales of his selfishness so that he can begin to learn how to be a true Narnian. Dumbledore guides Harry into his destiny by teaching him how to control his magic and his anger so that he can be the self-sacrificing servant leader he was made to be. Each of these involves an unbounded, unmoored individual learning to embrace a liturgy, a rhythm which shapes them and transforms their understanding of the world. We love these stories because we too were created for liturgy. In fact, not only are we created for liturgy, we participate in it whether we are aware of it or not. Liturgy is present in everything we do, from our day-to-day rhythms, at work and at home, to the friends we make, to our moments of play. You know these liturgies. They're the cadences which provide the beat of our day-to-day lives. We attend sports events and concerts. We walk in parades on the 4th of July, send greeting cards and roses to our significant others on Valentine's Day, and do egg hunts on Easter. We buy coffee at Starbucks on our way to work, or perhaps eat our favorite Italian food after church each Sunday. We take our pets for walks, go to the movies, play pickup basketball, take the shortcut to work on Mondays, get yearly checkups, clear out the garage in the spring, make resolutions in January, and abandon them in March. Every day, week, month, and year of our lives, we examine who we are and what we desire, and order our lives accordingly, from the most minuscule of concerns to the most momentous. You see, you are a creative type because creating liturgies is as natural to you and me as breathing. We need liturgy because it is the way we order our rhythms of worship. James K.A. Smith says that liturgies aim our love to different ends precisely by training our hearts through our bodies. I'm going to say that again. Liturgies aim our love to different ends precisely by training our hearts, our internal rhythms, through our bodies, the way that we express ourselves in the world. Worship is not something we create out of our willpower, as if we choose to be worshipful. We are intrinsically driven to worship, as naturally as we are driven to eat and drink. We are born with the innate capacity and desire to aim our love toward an end, and what we choose to love, we will worship. Liturgy is the way we engage with those deepest heart longings and bring them to life in the world around us. Proverbs adjures the reader to guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. I particularly like the way that the New American Standard Bible phrases this. Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. What comes from our heart either hydrates and nourishes that which lies along the banks of our lives, or it poisons and diminishes it. Whatever internal desires drive us will inevitably become manifest in our lives and in the world around us. We will create rhythms to make our hopes and dreams real. You see, we are incarnate creatures. You've heard that word today, I'm certain of it. Incarnation, mirroring the person of Christ. We are not ethereal spirits accidentally placed in a physical body, waiting for evacuation to a disembodied spiritual realm. We are created in God's image, body and soul. And through his redemption, Scripture tells us we look forward to a future in which heaven and earth are both restored, a future in which God is making all things new. We are created to seek reconciliation between our internal desires and the external world in which we live. This is a God-given urge mirroring the Trinity itself, an eternal heavenly Father who, through the creativity of the Son and by the breath of the Spirit, transfigured a divine idea into the fullness of creation, and this creation finds its purpose and continuation in the incarnate Christ, who is, as John so boldly puts it, the Word, an abstract, intangible thought, a concept, made flesh, a tangible thing existing in space and time, touchable and knowable. How do we know that the world around us is good? Because Jesus is its source and its sustenance. St. Paul tells us how this is in Colossians. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. Remember, the Word made flesh. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. And here's where it ties into where we are now. Through him, God reconciled everything to himself. He made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. In the beginning, God called his creation very good, and there was no barrier between desire and satisfaction, because the true source and aim of all our desires, our longings, and our loves, God himself, was present and accessible in his creation. Lanier actually mentioned, for those of you who were in her talk, or maybe for those of you who weren't, she was talking about the medieval imagination. And one of the things she said is that for somebody in the medieval period, they would have seen nature as a second book, as an additional testament to God's creative presence in the world. And I think that's so beautiful. I love that concept. When man sinned and marred that good creation, God revealed Jesus in bodily form in our own time and space. Eternity stepped into time, and the two narratives were inexorably merged. The Word was made flesh. Jesus' incarnation harkens back to that very moment of creation itself, affirming all over again that what God has created is very good and is worth redeeming. Yes, you are a creative type because you were created to incarnate. You were brought into being to bring more of God's presence into the world, and when you do bring it into the world or encounter it along the way, you are able to echo your Creator and call it very good. You have the power to channel the liturgies you create and craft them into living windows through which those around you glimpse Jesus. Everything we do as a community of Christ followers is to seek that end. And it is from this common goal that our collective outworking, our culture as the people of God, ensues. You see, liturgy produces culture. Culture is the byproduct of the liturgies we create and enact to fulfill our desires. I was thinking about it earlier. Liturgy is the means through which we put imagination to work. So when you think about taking this idea of meaning that Lanier talked about earlier and how to enact that, liturgy is the means through which you do that. Culture is the consequence of our group attempt to seek satisfaction, happiness, fulfillment, to achieve the fullness of what it is to be a human. Culture doesn't exist in a vacuum, but rather is a result of the story we tell ourselves and those around us over a long period of time. Liturgy produces culture. Our own contemporary culture is replete with liturgies, strong ingrained rhythms which radically shape us. Madeleine L'Engle's classic children's fantasy, A Wrinkle in Time, captures the concept of the power inherent in liturgy when its protagonists, Meg and her brother Charles Wallace and their friend Calvin, visit the planet of Camazotz in search of Meg and Charles Wallace's father. At first, everything seems to be in order. People live in rows of houses, children play in the yard, and all the adults go to work on schedule. But they all sense that something isn't quite right. In fact, it all seems a bit too unified. Everyone is in file form, never breaking from the perfect beat of society. When one of the residents of Camazotz accidentally falls out of line, they are sent to the central intelligence. And it is here where the trio eventually discovers the source of the rhythms of the society on Camazotz, an enormous pulsating brain which subsumes all other societal rhythms, creating every beat to which the whole population marches. It is an all-consuming, overwhelming entity that devours any individual or group who chooses to believe in anything except the rightness of its cause. You see, there is no neutrality in liturgy. Either we will creatively and proactively create liturgies in the power of the Holy Spirit, living into the freedom for which Christ has set us free, or the world around us will create them for us, making us subservient to its relentless rhythms, just like the residents of Camazotz. Our own culture is full of these overpowering liturgies, these overpowering cadences, which in the void of the creative God, who ought to be the aim of our liturgical hopes, have reshaped our story. In the crisis of identity that we find ourselves in, we use busyness to distract ourselves, masking who we are with what we do. Over time, this has distanced us from positive, godly liturgies, such as whole, enriching homes, a sense of meaning in our vocations, and a connection to life-giving communities. As a result, we find ourselves increasingly isolated. To fill the gap, we look to other cultural liturgies, such as social media. What should otherwise be a neutral tool is used as a dam to hold back the onslaught of aloneness. In this process, we often reverse the means of incarnation, choosing instead to de-incarnate our real selves, to remove our flesh and body and become disembodied digital forms bound to a very different sort of eternal transcendence, the infinite boundlessness of the internet. Here we can recreate ourselves in any image we want. And yet the image never satisfies because it doesn't reflect who we are or what we need, being as we are flesh and blood creatures created by God through the incarnate Jesus, who has affirmed over and again, not least through his resurrection and bodily ascension, that what he has created is good. And yet there are those who recognize in these digital ghosts we have created of ourselves the desire for embodiment again, and in a clever lie promise to provide us a way back into the promised land of the material world, now transformed from the means through which we encounter our creative creator God, and instead it has become simply an end in itself. We are led into the liturgy of consumerism, in which we take and consume and devour and are never sated, exponentially needing more and exponentially feeling the lack of satisfaction. Eventually, these profane liturgies achieve their final end, creating within us the sense that our identity, our story, is to satisfy all hungers, affirm all urges, and find the ultimate purpose of existence in the denial of everything except what the self desires. No longer free, we are mere drones, chained to the relentless beat of our desires, materialism, individualism, instant gratification. Can you hear the beat? The giant brain in our culture is the hell of isolating self-worship, which imprisons us in our own minds and keeps us stuck there through the deeply ingrained liturgies we have accepted as simply part and parcel of our lives. You see, this is the peril of liturgy. It's more than merely formational. It is transformational. Through the liturgical rhythms in which we participate, somehow those habits which we enact in our lives begin to redefine our perception of reality, changing the very way we look at ourselves, others, and the world around us. So yes, you are a creative type, because how you creatively shape your liturgy will define what you become. And when you enact Spirit-inspired, Christ-centered liturgies in your life, it is one of the greatest acts of defiance against the darkness of a broken world in which you can participate. This is because liturgy draws us together so that what we become as a collective people. The Greek word from which liturgy originates, liturgia, implies a work of the people, an act in which individuals are drawn into a larger story than their own. Alexander Schmemann, the 20th century Greek Orthodox priest and theologian, phrased it this way: liturgy is an action by which a group of people become something corporately which they had not been as a mere collection of individuals, a whole greater than the sum of its parts. I was speaking with my father Clay, who's here today, about this this topic, and he mentioned that it's like moving from an aggregation, which is just a collection of individuals who just happen to be somewhere, and it moves them from that aggregation into congregation, where they become something together. They're still the individuals that they were before, but they have transcended beyond just themselves to participate in a greater story. Liturgy is contagious, and it spreads by the witness of those who have been transformed by it. Liturgy is the ordering of your gospel in time and space. The process of participating in a shared liturgy moves a given group of people past saying, "These are some cool things I've tried, and you should try it too," to stating with conviction, "This is my story, and I'm sticking to it." So what is our story? Our story is Christ, his incarnation, his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. If we allow ourselves to be shaped by this story, every liturgical outworking we attempt will be, in a sense, a retelling of this story. This is no less true for our liturgies in our day-to-day life than it is for the liturgy we encounter in a church service. However, those ancient movements of liturgy in the historical church provide a rich and transformative picture of how a Christ-centered liturgy might look in the moments of our lives outside the four walls of a church. Such liturgy is a grand and theatrical affair, engaging every one of our senses and in drawing us, body, mind, and spirit, into the drama at hand. At the beginning of the service, we are prepared by the patterns of observing and responding. Observing and responding. We hear music, and our emotions are brought into alignment with what our mind has already come prepared to accomplish. The melodies of praise begin the gathering work of liturgy, drawing us out of our individual stories and into the story we are all living out together as a body. Candles are lit at the altar to signify the promise of Christ's light in the world, and soon after we see the cross, which moves through the people of God to its place beside the altar. In that moment, we have a sense that Christ is moving among us, his cross leading us forward to where we will die to our own darkness and live anew to his light. The Word of God is proclaimed to us through the readings of Scripture and through the sermon, and we respond with praise, prayer, and confession. First admitting the sins which isolate us and tear our love for one another apart, and then with the rejoicing in the forgiveness of those sins by passing the peace of Christ to one another. And when those rhythms of observation and response have prepared our hearts and made us ready, we are invited to go from observers of the story to full participants in it. When we approach the table and receive the elements, we are taking Christ's story onto ourselves. In the Eucharist, we encounter the living Christ who has made our hearts his home. And when we, as a body, have received the gift of his body and blood, we walk away unified, the liturgy having bound us together as a living sacrament of Christ's presence in the world. Yes, you are a creative type, because through you, God is creatively revealing himself, incarnating his presence to a world which, though it may not know it, desperately desires Jesus. A world which God has declared very good, and which, through you and me together, his body, he is remaking, restoring, and recreating. If we can grasp this, if we can see how Christ-centered liturgies point us in the right direction, we can know that desire itself is actually godly, and that in this broken culture we find ourselves in, those around us have desires which originate in godly longings, in innate godly longings, but rather than directing those desires toward the fulfillment in their proper end, Christ, they are being aimed through radically unchristian liturgies toward ends that corrupt, bring unhappiness, and cast them into darkness. The object of our work, then, is not to reject their desires. It is to help reorient their desires in the direction of Jesus. And liturgy is the means of transformation that we are given. This culture needs new liturgy, a new story it can take up as its own. We have the power to use our liturgies to tell a different story and to draw those around us into that redemptive story. For artists, there is a popular mantra that acts as a sort of overarching motto for storytelling. Show, don't tell. Let your audience see the truth. This is how we ought to communicate the gospel as well. And the liturgies in our lives are the ways we show others the beauty of Christ. Yes, sharing the gospel is very, very necessary, and we should all be involved in doing it as often as the opportunity arises. But how much more powerful would it be if we were to pair that invitation to the gospel with a life lived out like a grand work of art, where each discipline we've drawn into our life shines out like elegant strokes on a canvas, where our homes vibrantly express the colors of intentional love, delicious food, inviting hospitality, and engaged community, where our churches weave an elegant and inviting pattern of liturgical life, godly fellowship, a worship rooted in beauty and love, and a kind, warm engagement with our surrounding communities. Yes, you are a creative type, because as Ephesians tells us, we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so that we can do the good things He planned for us long ago. You are a work of art, and the way you live your life has the potential to both express the handiwork of the master artist and to participate in the brushstrokes that make your life and your shared life with others. Remember, this is a unifying practice in liturgy, a sublime and glorious artistic expression of the incarnate goodness of Christ. With all this said, it could seem to be a very daunting task then to create such liturgies. It may seem like the stakes are extremely high and that the work to accomplish this is too great a task. It could be easy to be discouraged by the challenge of enacting meaningful liturgies. I want to affirm to you that a works-oriented pressure to just purely perform and to create ex nihilo is not at the heart of what I'm getting at here for us as liturgy creators. This is not something you need to develop from scratch, first because Christ is there before you, showing you the way, just all of us together. As a matter of fact, I am certain each and every one of you already has godly liturgies in your life, which you practice on a regular basis. Let me outline what some of those may look like. Probably, most, if not all of you, are involved in a regular church where you attend and engage in community activities. Perhaps some of you regularly make time to have a family dinner together with a home-cooked meal. Maybe, if you're like me, you go hiking or walking so as to engage with God's creation and be renewed by beauty. I'm certain most of us enjoy certain films, music, artwork, books, and other cultural touch points that help us engage with our faith on a more profound level. And I'm certain that you have heard many of those cultural touch points from the speakers today who have shared with you their love for these books and movies and the music that they listen to. You might ask your children about their day, or say, I love you each night to your spouse. Each of those things is a shaping liturgy. And if you have any good and virtuous rhythms like that, you're already involved in the redemptive work that liturgy accomplishes. The very fact that you are here today to hear each of these speakers and grapple with big ideas communicates that you are willing to participate in activities that form and shape you into a more holistic Christian. The main idea in all of this is to inspire us to become more aware of our rhythms, to be able to identify the liturgies in our life so that we can master them and engage with them creatively. Socrates, shortly before his death, gave us the greatest of all liturgical mottos: the unexamined life is not worth living. We have great creative power in how we craft our liturgies, and if we can learn to move from being reactive in our lives, simply letting liturgies around us happen to us, to becoming proactive, owning our current liturgies and imagining new ones, both our lives and the lives of others around us will begin to benefit. So, how are we going to do this today? So we're going to sort of go back to the elements of engagement I talked about a few minutes ago from a traditional worship service. We're going to use that as our model to sort of show us the way. Observation, response, participation. When we observe, we widen our knowledge and understanding and are able to articulate that knowledge more powerfully, thus be able to respond and speak it back into being. In turn, this makes us able to integrate those elements in our lives as a pattern in which we can participate and invite others to participate. What we observe, what we internalize, we are then able to take and reimagine back into the world. Ben was talking about this a little bit earlier in his discussion about artistry, about waiting and letting that waiting process and that listening process and that observing process enrich your soul and widen your knowledge so that when you speak, you have this newness of concept to speak back into the world. So we're going to sort of do this for the next 20 or 25 minutes with different works of art. We're going to write down answers to 3 specific questions, which you have in your brochures on the first page. And we'll do this twice, once with a piece of music and once with a work of fine art. This is an exercise that we're using art as a means to sort of show how this works, but you can apply this in basically any area of your life. A conversation with a friend, maybe one of your rhythms at work. Maybe you have a really frustrating moment and you're trying to discover why it's frustrating. That actually, when you observe and when you consider it and then you respond back and you speak it and say, this is what was happening, you're then able to create a liturgy in your practice as you move forward, so that you can recognize that again and put it into context. That's how this is how this observation and response works. It's the idea to get us all to stop, look, and listen. We live in a very fast-paced culture, and even the best of us, and I am not the best of us, get very wrapped up into those fast-paced liturgies. I want to confess and speak very clearly that I, as much as anyone, am tempted and drawn into those liturgies of the modern era. And so when we stop and look and listen, we're retraining our minds. We're reimagining new paths in which to walk. We're being mavericks within culture. That is what counterculture is. Not rejecting culture outright, but creating new culture by practicing liturgies. Stop, look, and listen. After we've completed that bit, we're going to go into a time where we're going to sort of separate into different corners, and I'm going to allow you to work on a liturgical game plan or blueprint, as it were. And this is basically, you might already know a lot of these rhythms, and I'll talk about it later, but you're going to sort of identify, and we'll all work on this, identify liturgies that exist currently in your life, good liturgies. Try to find liturgies that you feel are detrimental or that limit your capacity to grow and walk in good ways. And then maybe identify some new liturgies that you'd like, that maybe you've thought about for a long time that you would really like to work on. When you state it, when you write it down, you're giving yourself a capacity to remember and to recall, again, that this is something that's important to you. That's one of the biggest parts of liturgy. I think often of how in the Old Testament the Israelites are always told to remember and to recall, and when they cross the River Jordan, they're asked to put memorial stones in it. And this is because we need manifested points that remind us of who we are. That's what a liturgy is. A liturgy isn't just to sort of help you walk in a certain way. It's to remind you when you forget, because we all forget. It's our nature to move forward and to lose over time. So liturgy shapes us in that way.